Okay guys, we're going to attempt two things with this video. The first is to run through the muscle anatomy for UEC, and the second piece is to kind of group all the muscles based off of their actions. And we're going to see how much this helps. So just a quick run through the muscles. We're going to start with wrist flexors and extensors as a group. The first three muscles, flexor carpi radialis, originates on the medial epicondyle, and inserts on the base of the second and third metacarpal. It is a wrist flexor and a radial deviator, or abductor. Second is palmaris longus, also originating on the medial epicondyle, inserting into the flexor retinaculum and palmar aponeurosis. It is a wrist flexor and a tensor of the palmar fascia. Third is flexor carpi ulnaris, also originating on that medial epicondyle, inserting on the base of the fifth metacarpal, pisiform and hamate. It is a wrist flexor and an ulnar deviator or adductor. So, in regards to our wrist flexors, all of them commonly originate on the medial epicondyle. They're all three obviously wrist flexors. If they have the term radialis in it, they will perform radial deviation or abduction, and if they have ulnaris in the name, they'll perform ulnar deviation or adduction. Also on the medial epicondyle is pronator teres, originating there, coming across and inserting on the lateral side of the radial shaft. It is a pronator and an elbow flexor. On the lateral side, we have our wrist extensors, supinator, and brachioradialis. So let's start with our wrist extensors. Our first one is extensor carpi radialis longus, originating on the lateral epicondyle, inserting on the base of the second metacarpal. Extensor carpi radialis brevis originates on the lateral epicondyle and inserts on the base of the third metacarpal. Extensor carpi ulnaris originates on the lateral epicondyle, inserts on the base of the fifth metacarpal. So a lot of parallels between the flexors and extensors and those attachments. Obviously, your extensor group will extend the wrist. The two radialis muscles, longus and brevis, will do radial deviation. The one ulnaris muscle will do ulnar deviation. Okay, and like the medial epicondyle was the common origin for your wrist flexors, the lateral epicondyle the common origin for your wrist extensors. In addition, we have supinator also on the lateral epicondyle and below the radial notch in the back, wrapping around, inserting on the radial shaft. It is an active supinator and a flexor of the elbow. Brachioradialis originates on the lateral supracondylar ridge. It inserts on the styloid process of the radius. So it doesn't cross the wrist, it doesn't perform any wrist actions, but it is a elbow flexor, specifically from the neutral position. From there, we can move up into the anterior and posterior arms. On the anterior side, we have biceps brachii, a two-bellied muscle. The short head originates on the coracoid process of the scapula. The long head originates on the supraglenoid tubercle. Both heads will merge together to insert on the radial tuberosity. It is a supinator, an elbow flexor, and a flexor of the shoulder. Coracobrachialis originates on the coracoid process, like that short head, but inserts on the medial shaft of the humerus. It is also a shoulder flexor and a strong shoulder adductor. Brachialis originates on the anterior humeral shaft and inserts on the tuberosity of the ulna. It is simply an elbow flexor. So we now have our five elbow flexors: pronator teres, supinator, brachioradialis, biceps brachii, and brachialis. Brachialis is your primary elbow flexor. Okay, from the back or posterior side, we have anconeus, which originates on the lateral epicondyle, so another lateral epicondyle muscle, and it's just crossing the posterior elbow to the olecranon process. So it is a elbow extensor, and it's an assister to elbow extension. It's only one of two muscles that does elbow extension. The other is your triceps. Triceps, like the word tri will indicate, is a three-bellied muscle. You have a long head, a lateral head, and a medial head. The long head originates on the infraglenoid tubercle of the scapula, and the medial and lateral heads originate on the posterior humerus. All three bellies are going to merge together to insert on this olecranon process on the posterior ulna, and they are very, very strong elbow extensors. In addition, you're going to get adduction from that long head, shoulder adduction from that shoulder. Last is deltoids. Deltoids is going to originate, well, let's start first. There's three heads of deltoid: an anterior, a middle, and a posterior. Anterior head originates on the distal third of the clavicle. Middle deltoid originates on the acromion process. Posterior deltoid originates on the scapular spine. Just like the insertions for trapezius, by the way. All three are going to merge together to insert on the deltoid tuberosity, and all three bellies are going to perform abduction of the shoulder. The anterior belly will also perform flexion. The posterior belly will also perform extension. So those are all of your muscles. What I want to do now is just kind of go through grouped motions. So we're going to go through wrist, we're going to go through elbow, we're going to go through shoulder, we're going to talk about the groups involved. So let's start with wrist. So if I perform, let's use this end, if I perform wrist flexion, okay, I'm utilizing flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor carpi ulnaris, right? The concept that I really want you guys to understand over time is that by flexing my wrist, I'm shortening these tissues, but I'm lengthening my extensors. So if I wanted to lengthen my flexors, let's say to assess their range, I would go into extension to see how well I can do in that motion, okay? So wrist extension will lengthen the wrist flexors, the three I just mentioned. Wrist flexion will lengthen the wrist extensors, okay? So in question form, this tends to throw a lot of people off. So I might say something like, a client presents with limitations in wrist extension. Which muscles would I work? Well, I would have to pick a muscle that does wrist flexion, right? Because that's the motion holding that extension back. I might also say a client presents with symptoms that are suggestive of problems with palmaris longus. Which movement assessment might be limited with a tight palmaris longus? Well, wrist extension, because that's the opposite of what it does, right? So what movement lengthens a wrist flexor? Wrist extension. What movement is limited when wrist flexors are tight? Wrist extension. It's just going into the opposite motion, okay? So for wrist extension, my group of muscles are extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor carpi ulnaris. Let's do the wrist flexion again. Wrist flexion, flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, palmaris longus, okay? Radial deviation, or abduction, flexor carpi radialis, extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis. Adduction or ulnar deviation, flexor carpi ulnaris, extensor carpi ulnaris. Okay, if I go into elbow flexion, 5 muscles: supinator, pronator teres, brachioradialis, biceps brachii, brachialis. These are my 5 elbow flexors. My primary is brachialis. Elbow extension is going to be triceps and anconeus. And again, if my triceps and anconeus are tight, what motion is going to be limited? Well, elbow flexion will be limited. I won't be able to go into full range because my elbow extensors are tight. So that's my assessment. If I want to see if these muscles are tight, I'm going to have my client go into elbow flexion, it's getting really blurry, and see if they can get full range of motion. Okay? Okay, so elbow flexion, biceps brachialis, better. Extension, triceps anconeus, right? That would be the interplay. So 5 elbow flexors, pronator teres, supinator, brachioradialis, biceps brachialis. 2 elbow extensors, triceps and anconeus. All right, supination, you're going to get supinator and biceps brachii. Pronation, you're going to get pronator teres. Right, shoulder flexion, long head of biceps, anterior deltoid. Okay, coracobrachialis. Adduction, coracobrachialis, long head of triceps. Extension, posterior deltoid.